Hi, and welcome to this video on the EU-COVAT-1H study. This is a video summarizing the results of the Part B of this multinational phase 2 randomized adaptive trial to evaluate immunogenicity and reactogenicity of different COVID-19 vaccines in older adults. That means older than 75 years. This trial is part of the VACCELERATE consortium, which is an EU-funded project involving several partners within this network. The sponsor of the H study is the University of Cologne, and we work together with several partners around the European Union. The statistics was in charge at the Medical University of Vienna. We had the biobanking in Antwerp and the central lab in Dublin. Furthermore, several study sites were involved in 4 European countries, which I will present later on. The aims and objectives of the studies are summarized on this slide. We aimed primarily to compare the immune response between 2 treatment arms after a 4th vaccination dose against SARS-CoV-2 virus. That means a second booster, considering that a immunization regimen of 2 vaccines is considered as a standard immunization scheme. The secondary objectives included the humoral response against wild-type SARS-CoV-2 between the 2 study arms after a second booster dose, and to evaluate the humoral response against variant concerns as well. Furthermore, we wanted to describe the long-term humoral immune response after the second booster. That means after 12 months in this trial, but this data is not yet included in this presentation. There were several exploratory objectives included in the study protocol. One of them was to investigate the cellular immune response after the booster dose, the virus neutralization capacity against variants of concern, and those were largely carried out in subpopulations or subcohorts of the full study cohort. Furthermore, there were safety objectives, and that was generally to assess the safety of the vaccination in the full study population. The endpoints that were derived from those objectives are summarized here. So the primary endpoint was considered to be, or was determined to be, the rate of a 2-fold antibody titer increase following the 4th dose or the second booster dose, measured by a quantitative assay. And we measured the antibodies against the receptor binding domain of SARS-CoV-2 wild-type virus, so the first Wuhan variant. The secondary endpoints were the neutralizing activity against the wild-type virus and the variants of concern following the second booster dose at day 14 and month 12. Whereas the month 12 data is not yet included here, and the antibody titer levels at 12 months after the booster dose, measured by the same assay as after 14 days. The safety endpoints that are equal as important as the immunogenicity endpoints were the unsolicited adverse events until the end of the trial, the solicited adverse events for 7 days after the booster dose administration, and the rate of severe adverse events up to 3 months after the in-study vaccination. There are further exploratory endpoints which were mostly linked to the utilization of novel laboratory assays to test neutralizing activity of the antibodies expressed by the trial participants. Here's an overview on the main inclusion and exclusion criteria for Part B of this trial. So first of all, as this trial only included an older population, all participants had to be 75 years old or older, and they had to be already fully vaccinated with one of those following vaccination regimens. So the priming regimen plus the first booster dose, and basically what is important here is that the booster dose had to be one of the licensed mRNA vaccines, while the priming regimen could also consist of the AstraZeneca vaccine, as pointed out below in this list. And the last vaccination within this scheme had to be at least 1 month prior to study entry. And of course, they had to provide written informed consent. The exclusion criteria mostly included general exclusion criteria from clinical trials. And of importance is that current immunosuppressive therapy was considered an exclusion criterion to not deviate the results of the antibody titers. This is an overview on the recruiting sites within this trial. As you can see, several European countries were a part of this trial, amongst them Norway, Lithuania, Spain, and Germany. There were 4 recruiting sites in Spain, and 3 in Germany, and 1 each in Norway and Lithuania. And as I'm speaking about part B all the time, I need to do a brief recap on part A of this trial, just to explain a little further why this trial was basically splitted in 2, which was not planned when the protocol was developed. However, due to the ongoing dynamic of the COVID-19 pandemic, the policy makers within the European Union decided to change vaccination schedules and recommendations after more or less 2 years of the ongoing pandemic, to recommend second booster doses in at-risk populations, and that of course includes older adults. And that was the reason why Part A was then terminated as an own part of this trial, and Part B was developed. In Part A, participants received a first booster dose after a priming regimen consisting of 2 SARS-CoV-2 vaccinations. This is the overview on the intervention in this trial, in Part A of this trial. And as I already showed for Part B of this trial, you can see that those were basically 6 arms, while those contribute to 2 intervention arms, 1 arm receiving the Moderna mRNA vaccine and 1 arm receiving the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine as study intervention. And as I pointed out in Part A, this was the first booster dose. And the summary of the Part A was that only 53 subjects were enrolled between November 2021 and January 2022. And after that, the changes in vaccination policy came into place, so that a major protocol amendment was necessary. And after enrollment of these 53 subjects, 25 received the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and 27 received the Moderna vaccine. 1 subject dropped out before vaccination. Actually, the results showed that there were some indicators for higher antibody titers and higher neutralization activity with the Moderna vaccine. And it needs to be pointed out that the Moderna vaccine was administered at a 100 microgram dose, which is a double dose compared to the licensed vaccine within the European Union. However, both vaccination regimens were considered very safe in this small sample of subjects of advanced age. That's it for Part A. Now let's really jump into the Part B results. And as I showed you an intervention overview for Part A, this is the intervention overview on Part B. And this adds up to 6 more cohorts within this trial, in total summing up to 18 arms. But we are mostly speaking about intervention groups here, and those are the 2 groups receiving either the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine or the Moderna vaccine within the study as a second booster. The enrollment of the study took place between February 2022 and September 2022 at the trial sites I showed you before, and 270 subjects were enrolled in total. 135 subjects received the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and 135 subjects received the Moderna vaccine as a second booster dose. And of course, as in every trial, there were some dropouts on the way, and the follow-up of those subjects was completed in September 2023. This is the consort diagram. I hope it's visible on your screens. And what you can see is that after allocation, there were dropouts in the study arm of Pfizer-BioNTech on the left side and the Moderna arm on the right side. And there were 5 dropouts here and 4 dropouts here. One subject was lost to follow-up in the Moderna arm. So in the final analysis, 134 participants in the Pfizer-BioNTech arm and 135 in the Moderna arm could be included, as we agreed on analyzing all available data of trial participants. That means if a subject discontinued study participation, for example, due to withdrawal of informed consent, we still analyzed the immunogenicity data available up to this point of withdrawal. So let's go deeper into the results of part B. Those are the demographics, and I'll just briefly wanted to show you that the age is really high here with a median of 79 years. And if you look at the mean, it's even higher, around 81 years. This is pretty interesting. Furthermore, you see the priming vaccine regimen was also pretty similar among both groups. So most of the participants, of course, had received mRNA vaccinations as priming regimen, and most of them actually received a priming and first booster regimen consisting of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Those are the baseline characteristics, and as I already said on the slide before, you can see here the mean age in the Moderna arm as well as in the Pfizer-BioNTech arm was around 81 years, and this is really a notable fact around this study cohort. And you can see the vaccines that were administered as study intervention here. We see that we had a good distribution of gender between 2 cohorts, and other details were also pretty similar, pretty comparable between the 2 groups. Now, regarding the primary endpoint, the results showed that large parts in both groups were able to reach the primary endpoint, which was a 2-fold change in antibodies at day 14 after study intervention, so after the second booster, and those were 78.3% in the Pfizer-BioNTech arm and 87.2% in the Moderna arm. Those are further subgroup analyses by priming regimen regarding the primary endpoint. So we're looking at a table, the 2 groups again, Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech, and the participant that reached a 2-fold antibody titer change at day 14. And we can see that numbers were slightly higher, but not really statistically significant. Also, you don't see any p-values here, but the absolute numbers were higher in participants that had received a priming regimen with the AstraZeneca vaccine here, which is kind of interesting, but that's just what we observed. However, it needs to be pointed out that the groups were really small here. You see only 8 participants in the Moderna group, and among them, only 8 had the priming regimen with the AstraZeneca vaccine and an mRNA first booster. So now a few words regarding the exploratory analysis. So we actually assessed the fold change multiple times, and this is the data for a 4-fold change antibody titer increase and the geometric mean fold rise in all participants. And this is interesting because we already see a higher deviation, and I'll show you this as a figure in a minute, between the Pfizer-BioNTech arm and the Moderna arm, where 63.2% reached a 4-fold antibody titer change between study intervention and day 14, while only 52% in the Pfizer-BioNTech group did so. And furthermore, we have this differentiated the geometric mean titer change according to the priming regimen. I won't go into detail here because this is really This is really comparing numbers in very small subcohorts, but for your interest, if you want to see this data, it's represented here. And further exploratory analysis included equivalence, and this is the data we evaluated here. Now jumping into the figures to make this a little more plastic and more visual, this is an overview of the antibody titer increase against the receptor binding domain at day 14 on a logarithmic scale here. And you can see day 0 is here and day 14 is here. On the left, it's the Pfizer-BioNTech group, and on the right, the Moderna group. And as you can see, most lines are going up, which means that the antibody titer increase took place after vaccination, which is important to note, as we know that older adults may have impaired immune function, but in our cohort we saw, as I already said, a high proportion of participants reached this primary endpoint, so the antibody titer increased by twofold at day 14 after vaccination. This is also an interesting slide to visualize the X-fold increase of antibody titers, and the red graph is the BioNTech group, and the blue one is the Moderna group. And as we can see, that reached an X-fold change, and the X-fold change is here on the X-axis. And as you can see, basically in any fold titer, we see that the Moderna group was slightly superior to the Pfizer-BioNTech group. We did not any comparative statistics due to the small sample size, but this graph visualizes kind of the immune response and the amount of antibody titer increase between these two groups. Now, regarding the safety endpoints, which, as you may recall, were also included within the most important endpoints of this trial, as in any vaccination trial. And generally, and as expected, pain at injection site was the most frequent adverse events in both groups, and other systemic adverse events like fatigue or asthenia were also very frequent in both groups, while headache and hyperhidrosis were more frequently reported after the vaccination in the Moderna group. There's a brief table to compare both groups. On the left, the Moderna group, and on the left, the Pfizer-BioNTech group. And as you can see, almost half of participants did not report any adverse events, which is also pretty notable for a vaccination trial. And this table displays the worst grade of adverse events for every subject. And as you can see, this decreases with the time, and there were only one severe adverse events of grade 3 in the Pfizer-BioNTech group and 4 in the Moderna group, respectively, and one severe adverse events in the Pfizer-BioNTech group in total, which was attributed to the study intervention. There were actually more severe adverse events among this cohort, which was also expected due to the older age of the participants, where some underlying diseases may cause health problems. However, those were generally not attributed to the study vaccination if they were not related with the vaccination. On this spiderweb graphs, we have the general disorders and administration site conditions, which were summarized, for example, as the pain at injection site. And it's easy to see that this was the most frequent adverse events among both groups. The blue one is the Moderna group, and the red one, the Pfizer-BioNTech group. But also injection site swelling or urticaria, malaise, or fatigue were present in both groups, and with a slightly higher prevalence in the Moderna group. So the most frequent adverse events I already mentioned before were the injection site pain, fatigue, and malaise. That's the same slide with the table, and we go over to the organ system classes adverse events, also up to 7 days after the vaccinations. We have the spider graph again, and here headache, insomnia, also dizziness and hyperhidrosis were prevalent mostly in the Moderna group, as I already said before, but also myalgia, arthralgia, decreased appetite, or nausea, which are frequently reported adverse events after any vaccination, were present in our cohort as well. The most frequent ones in this group were headache with 17%, myalgia with 8.1%, and insomnia with 9.6%. We go over the next slide again. And now I want to go a little bit into detail on the exploratory endpoints of virus neutralization capacity, because this is interesting to see how this capacity is changing in the full study population with upcoming variants of concern. So this is the virus neutralization capacity at day 0, so before the second booster dose. And you see here on the left side, those are the plots for the BioNTech group, and on the right side for the Moderna group. And you see in different colors the SARS-CoV-2 variants, starting on the left-hand side with the Wuhan wild-type variant, so to say, in gray, and then going through the alpha, beta, gamma, delta variant, delta here in blue, up to the variant of concern, XBB1, the Omicron variant, which was frequent when we carried out this trial, and those are in green. And as you can see here, it's also easy to observe that the virus neutralization capacity already before the vaccination was higher in the previous variants, so previous before the Omicron variant came up, which of course explains the immune escape mechanism of the Omicron variant. And this is the same assay 14 days after the study intervention, so after the second booster dose against SARS-CoV-2. And here it's interesting to note that the neutralization capacity against the wild type and the falling variants was also higher, also in median higher than against the circulating Omicron variants. However, we saw an increase in capacity in almost all participants, as you can see. However, with very broad ranges, you can see basically for all variants, the virus neutralization is varying along the whole scale. And this may also be attributed to the small sample size of the study. This is basically the same results as a heat map, where you can see that the Wuhan wild type had the highest virus neutralization capacity with the antibodies measured at day 14, and the lowest mean virus neutralization capacity was measured in certain Omicron variants. So here, BA3 and the BQ11 variant, which was present before the XBB1 variant. And with this, I'd like to summarize the findings of Part B of the EU-COVAT-1H study. So we observed that the 4th dose, so a second booster dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which was administered with a 30 microgram licensed dose, versus the Moderna mRNA vaccine, which was administered at 100 microgram, so a double dose compared to the licensing, appeared safe in this sample of 270 subjects of advanced age, who were aged 75 years or older. And we had some indicators for higher antibody titers against the receptor binding domain of SARS-CoV-2 with the Moderna vaccine, without losses in safety, with slightly higher rates of adverse events, but not really statistically significant or of high grade adverse events. And we see that immunosenescence seems to play a role in an elderly population, which has been hypothesized before, and the month 12 data of this trial will elucidate this hypothesis more. And with this, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and also thank to all investigators and contributors for the commitment and support throughout the conduct of this trial.